for what it was. I said, bitch, I had to get this shit out the mud, cause nobody didn't wanna show me love. I said, bitch, I don't gotta prove nothing to nobody. I said, bitch, I been on my body. I said, bitch, I been out the way. I said, bitch, I ain't the type to hate. I said, bitch, what's the reason to hate? I said, bitch, I ain't worrying about it, bitch, I been getting bags. I said, bitch, I been finger fucking the Drake. I said, baby, I got a lot of shit on my mind. I said, bitch, I don't got time for nobody waste my time. I said, bitch, I been on that grind. I said, baby, I don't really think nobody real no more. I said, bitch, don't mind them and check up on me. I said, bitch, I could be dead for real. I said, bitch, I could never hang with no snitch. I said, bitch, that's really it get. I said, bitch, this is what it is. I said, bitch, don't give a fuck how you feel. I said, baby, I don't wanna talk right now. I said, baby, my thoughts taking over right now. I said, baby, this is how I feel. I said, baby, my demon been hunting me. I said, bitch, I been want some peace. I said, baby, I hardly get no sleep. I said, bitch, my cousin been on my mind. I said, bitch, I pray I'll be alright. I said, bitch, I know my cousin watching over me. I said, bitch, I know he ain't proud how I'm moving for real. I said, baby, I been telling sticks, I ain't talking about no chopsticks. I said, bitch, this big ass Drake. I said, bitch, this big ass 9, this big ass 10 gon' knock you off your feet. I said, bitch, I got some of that shit going on. I said, bitch, I'm a rough rider, I don't got no time for nobody stressing me. I said, baby, I been running away from my problem, I don't wanna solve them. I don't got nobody call them. I said, baby, I feel like everybody changed up on me. I said, bitch, I don't wanna talk to nobody, I just feel like everybody weird. I said, baby, I don't want nobody near